Okay, so in the last video, we left off with the investment demand curve and its inverse relationship between the real interest rate and the amount of investment in the economy. In video 5, we're going to take that a step further, but let's just review real quick why this inverse relationship exists. When the real interest rate is high, firms are a lot more likely to put their money in the bank and not invest in capital. And remember, what we mean by investment is actually buying machinery. And so when the real interest rate is high, they will not buy machinery. They will just put their money in the bank. When the real interest rate is low, it will be much easier for them to get expected returns from the machines that they buy that are higher than the real interest rate. So it would make sense for them to buy machines and grow their business because the expected rate of returns from the machines will be higher than the real interest rate that they could have gotten if they were to put their money in the bank. So at very high real interest rate levels, very low investment, very low real interest rate levels, very high investments. That's why we have this inverse relationship. Now, the main component that determines basically the level of investment in our economy, the biggest, most important thing really is the level of real interest rate, right? So if the real interest rate is, let's say, at 4%, this example shows us that we're going to have, let's say, about $4.5 trillion worth of investment, let's say, okay, which means purchases by business, okay. Now, the investment demand curve, ID, can certainly shift, okay? Real interest rate changes will basically move us along the curve, right? So that's not going to be a shift. That's just, if the real interest rate goes down from 7 to 4%, investment increases from, almost from 1.8 to 4.5, let's say, okay? But there's certain things that will actually shift the curve. And I'm just going to go over them quickly. So these things are, for example, the acquisition, maintenance, and operating cost of this machinery, right? So if these costs increase, the expected rate of return from these investments decrease, and therefore the investment demand curve will shift to the left, right? It will decrease, okay? If the cost falls of maintaining these machines and to acquire these machines, then the investment demand curve will shift to the right. Okay. Business taxes. Certainly when businesses get taxed more, the investment demand curve will shift to the left because it's more costly to produce. When businesses are taxed less, the investment curve will shift to the right. Okay. Technological changes. So if there's innovation, investment will shift to the right. Stock of capital goods on hand. So if a firm has a lot of machinery on hand already, they're going to invest less. And if many firms in our country, in our economy, have them, then the investment demand curve will shift to the left as a whole for the economy. And then expectations. If business expect the future sales, future operational costs, and the future profitability to be poor, they won't increase their investment now. So it will shift to the left. But if they expect it to be good, they'll shift it to the right. Okay. Now, of course, investment shifting to the right versus the left. Investment shifting to the right means investment will increase. If it shifts to the left, it will decrease. And we can simply see it by if we already have a real interest rate established, let's say at 4%, and we are at about 4.5. Obviously, if the investment demand curve shifts to the right, and I'm just gonna copy and paste and shift, right? At 4% interest, you're gonna have a much larger amount of investment, right? So that's the idea. If it shifts to the left, you'll have less investment. Okay, so just a few more things about investment. It turns out that investment is not as stable as consumption. Consumption is relatively stable in our economy because consumption is purchases by people, and people need to eat food. they need to pay the rent, they need to warm their houses. These things are relatively constant, and therefore consumption is pretty stable. Investment is purchases by businesses, and that is a lot more unstable, okay, a lot more volatile. And the reason for it, there's a few reasons. Number one, there's variability in profits. So if the future profitability of the firm doesn't look very good, then they're not going to invest much. Okay, there is so obviously there's variability in expectations. There's irregularity in innovation. So maybe people will innovate a lot, and investment will shift to the right. But maybe there's going to be very little innovation one day or 1 year in an economy, and the investment will actually shift to the left. Okay, because people are not going to buy that many new machines. And also durability. Since investments are durable, they can be reused. During hard times, firms do not have to buy new capital. Okay. If firms anticipate a good future, they may buy a lot of new capital now. So there's a lot of things that can shift the amount of investment in our economy. Now what I'd like to do is introduce the investment schedule, which is different than the investment demand curve. So the level of investment in our economy, as we said, is basically decided by the level of real interest rate. So in this case, the real interest rate is 4%, and the level of investment is about 4.5%. The investment schedule is a graph that, let me just draw it over here, puts level of investment on the y-axis and the GDP on the x-axis. Okay, and so what you're seeing here is that we're actually going to make the assumption that the level of investment does not change with the level of GDP that we have, which is kind of a big, gross assumption to make. But we're basically saying that to make things simple in our model, the thing that will affect investment is real interest rate. And how much investment will be present at a certain level of interest rate, we can take that from the investment demand curve. So for example, in this case, the real interest rate is 4%. Investment is about $4.5 trillion. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our investment schedule graph, and we're going to go to $4.5 trillion, and it's going to remain constant no matter what the level of GDP is. Okay, until we have a change in investment, but that would be caused by a change in real interest rate or any other of the things that that shift the investment demand curve that I mentioned earlier. Okay, but basically the investment schedule is a straight line. Okay, the investment schedule. All right. So now what we got to do is we have to put the investment schedule and the consumption schedule together. So we're going to take the value of the investment, which is $4.5 trillion, and we're going to simply add it to our consumption schedule. Now the nice thing is that because that $4.5 trillion of investment is constant as GDP increases, we're simply going to add $4.5 trillion to our consumption schedule at each level of GDP. And so basically what we're looking at is a line that will be parallel. Right, and let's assume that, let's just say that this is, let me just take that out for a sec. Let's assume that this is the difference between C and C plus I is $4.5 trillion, right? And so what you're noticing is basically that the C plus I line looks like that in our model. The last thing I want to mention is that if you remember, the slope of the consumption function is the MPC. And because we're just having a vertical shift here, the slope of the consumption plus investment line will also be the MPC, the marginal propensity to consume.